Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today. We're working in this event for the 9th region, the Labor Tribunal. We have today Professor Noam Ebner, and welcome everybody. Wait a second here. Today I'm controlling everything. I have 5 screens in front of me. I'd like to really thank the Judicial School for our Judge Aramis, Luciano Coelho. I'd like to thank for Judge for conflict resolution for this Judge Lhaza, for giving support to all the courses that we are giving in the area of mediation. I'd like to thank all the supervisors that are here with us following Dorival, Marcos Blanco. I'd like to greet all of those who shared this action to make us get to this date, to this event. We have 2 ongoing courses. One is for 39 people with 150 hours. This is an action that actually closes this course. And also, we have another course for 60 judges, which is beginnings. We're still initiating this course. The main goal today is to really give all the hints for judges, lawyers, labor lawyers, citizens, unions, workers, for the importance for conflict resolution. We are actually saying that mediation is a great method for dispute solution. Actually, we're going to be talking about these 2 galaxies today, right? We're going to be mentioning Star Wars the whole morning today with Professor Noam Ebner. Professor Noam, he will be talking about his book on conflict resolution and Star Wars. I don't know him in person, but this is one of my favorite articles, nonverbal communication in negotiation. I really love this text. I mean, I really recommend his books for those who really love to encourage mediation. He is a mediator in his office in Jerusalem. He also, and actually he's really doing this for conflict resolution for many government bodies and universities and other places and other, He trained mediators for the court system, conducted hundreds of workshops. He also worked for government agencies, universities, and nonprofit organizations. He's one of the pioneers on online dispute resolution. He provides consultancy on the subject to universities and other institutions. He is the author and co-author in 4 books and more than 100 articles, book chapters, and so many other publications. He speaks about online dispute resolution, conflict resolution, mediation, and law. Together with Jane Reynolds, she's a professor of negotiation, civil processes, negotiation, civil procedures. They together wrote this book, this marvelous book that we're going to be talking about today. Through LinkedIn, I actually found out about this book, the book that I hold here in my hands. And about 4 or 5 months ago, I invited him to really, be with us, and he accepted, which was amazing. Professor Noam has been talking with, TikTokers, YouTubers, Harvard students, academics, researchers, and all the people that really support negotiation all over the world. And this about this, the fiction universe. I mean, Star Wars and all the epic battles and so on. There are so many deep themes which we see the conflict resolution. Star Wars and conflict resolution is a work together with Noam Ebner and Joan Reynolds that it brings so many suggestions and hints. And this the book actually teaches strategies and models of conflict resolutions. And the book is divided in two parts, and about 20 experts in the area are there. I haven't finished the book yet, but I've been reading, and I'm like so excited about how they deal with that, the use of the force, power, empathy in the art of negotiation. And it's great, to see how the Jedis do that. And so I will ask you to excuse me because I'm going to change to English.
And thank you for having me, for setting this up, for inviting these people from these two extraordinary courses and from further around the galaxy. This is wonderful. And thank you, Judge Fernando, and thank you, everybody. I'm practicing of late letting people say nice things about me and not immediately correcting them and saying, no, you don't understand. So thank you for all of the kind things you said. I'll say that of all the things, I have been in this area, in this business, in this world of conflict resolution for quite a while now. It seems like only yesterday, and here we are. I've been working in this area for 25 years, and I can say straight out that this project has been the most fun of any project that I've ever done in the realm of negotiation, of conflict resolution, of mediation. And that's a field with a lot of fun projects. And it's also, it's led to all sorts of connections, all sorts of new, fascinating, enthusiastic connections, just as you described, Fernando. You saw this on LinkedIn and you had to reach out to me, right? Because this guy, he's talking about Star Wars and he's talking about conflict. They put those together. And it turns out, and unsurprisingly, that there are some things that so many of us grew up on, and it's been a part of our lives for so long, and we never sort of brought it 3 steps forward into what we do in the world outside, and wondered how can we, since the whole person we are includes the childhood stories we know, and the movies that we loved as a child, or the books we loved as a child, how can we bring all of those into our world today, and use them in order to be better at what we do? So that's a part of why all this came into being. And before I go to the traditional, let me put on my presentation. I'd also like to say, I know that not everybody in the audience has necessarily seen Star Wars. And I know that those who have seen Star Wars, there are very many different levels of Star Wars fans, right? Ranging from a 2, which is, let's say, my mother was raised on the movies and she made me watch one when I was a child, and up to a 10, where you go to weddings dressed as Chewbacca, or maybe that's an 11. But you know what I'm talking about. I will do our best, and I think that Fernando, you and I together will be able to make this session meaningful for people who have never seen Star Wars before, and also be super fun for all of those 11s out there, if there are any. I'm not, for myself. I'm not an 11. Let me share my screen and jump into this. And as we go along, so on my screen I can only see Fernando, but of course I'm aware that there's a galaxy of people out there in this room with us. Please feel very welcome, right, to put your questions in their Q&A, and also there's a chat, and it can be an ongoing conversation. I probably won't understand most of it, but anything that needs to come my way will come my way. This is a topic that gets lots of people excited, including myself. So here's a bit of my background that should be pretty obvious by now. I grew up on Star Wars, is one way to put it. I was born in 1973. So I was a 4-year-old child hiding behind the seat in the movie theater when Darth Vader walked into the spaceship for that first time, the scariest creature I or anybody had ever seen. And ever since, the stories have been sort of a point to which I relate as I go through life. I'm sure I'm not the only person in this crowd who quotes Star Wars, perhaps at the right moment and perhaps at the wrong moment, depending on who they're talking with. And ever since I started studying conflict, this was at the very end of my first mediation lesson as a student. I walked out of the room and I said, oh, for the assignments in this course, I want to write all the assignments to be about Star Wars and mediation, because the connections were so obvious to the central themes of Star Wars. And it just came together in my mind that very first moment. And ever since then, I knew that someday I would write on Star Wars and negotiation and conflict resolution. Indeed, other people have written on the topic of Star Wars and other areas. There's the fact that Star Wars is such a widespread cultural phenomenon, and it's such a source of inspiration for other people. It's led others to write things such as a book on Star Wars and philosophy, that there's an entire series on popular culture and philosophy. There's more than one series. This series just had its 3rd book on Star Wars and philosophy come out. They're delightful books, and I've learned so much about philosophy through this bridge that they built between philosophy and Star Wars. A wonderful book on Star Wars psychology. There are other books on Star Wars and religion on Star Wars and physics. There's a book on behavioral economics and Star Wars. There's all sorts of things. So it's a source of inspiration, not only for me, but for many, 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 many people out there. And ever since I read the Star Wars and philosophy books, I knew that that would be sort of a model for how I would like to approach this if I ever went the distance of writing a book bridging between these two things. And you can use this in both directions. We can explain conflict resolution and negotiation points in order to better understand Star Wars. So a Star Wars fan learning about negotiation will appreciate the movies more. They'll learn things they didn't know about the movies. They might know every kind of spaceship in the series, what its name is, what its number is, and how many people can fly in it, and how much cargo it can carry, and what kind of weapons it has. But if you teach them something about conflict, they might understand the pilot better, and why the pilot chooses to use the ship fight or to run away or to attack or defend, etc. And the second on this two-way street, the second lane is that we can use examples from Star Wars as case studies, as examples of conflict situations and negotiation situations. Like Fernando said, there's a lot of action going on in Star Wars, right? There are ships shooting at each other and people shooting at each other with blasters and lightsabers going on. But when you really get into it, Star Wars is all about people. It's about relationships. It's about their struggles with one another, struggles between their ideologies, struggles on the personal level, people growing apart in different ways, people trying to persuade other people to do something that they're not naturally inclined to do, people trying to persuade people to be fundamentally different than who they think they are. Think about every time someone says, no, turn to the dark side, or no, turn to the light side. They're trying to persuade them to change something fundamental in their lives. So when we think, let's say, about negotiation, or for those of you who have studied or practiced mediation, think about mediation. Think about that issue of persuading others to make change. And how do we do that? And sometimes it's change about simple things, a transaction, and sometimes it's change about the most fundamental things in your universe, like whether you are aligned with the dark side or the light side. So there's a lot to work with. There's such a natural connection to make between Star Wars and conflict resolution. But I waited with this. I waited for about 20 years until there was a deeper purpose to fill. And that leads into the sort of the why here and why now. And the why now is like, I've as I said, I've been working in this field and I've been teaching in this field for nearly 25 years now. I've had the immense pleasure or privilege of leading a lot of people into this world of negotiation and conflict resolution. And I've noticed that even though there is more negotiation and conflict resolution training and teaching now than ever before, and these courses that have gathered here today are just one example. And there are more courts and more lawyers and more judges than ever before. There are also more court cases than ever before at any time in history. This is a problem in all of the countries that I come from, which is, as Fernando said, I have roots in the United States. I have roots in Israel. All of them are struggling with a tremendous backlog of court cases in their system. The last I heard of Brazil, which was a couple of years ago, is tens of millions, or it was 100 million. I don't remember the number. Maybe you've solved it in the 2 or 3 years since I learned about that, but probably not. So the point being made is not that that there's a problem with the court system. The issue is that there is so much conflict going on in the world, and that is not diminishing just because you and I and so many other people are dealing in this field and trying to bring a more peaceable world. Roger Fisher and William Ury in their book, which many of you may have read, Getting to Yes, they opened it up by saying conflict is a growth business. And it is so true. And it is deeply depressing. On the one hand, to use an Americanism, it's putting my kids through college in the sense that, it's been my profession. And so many of us have worked in this area, have made it both our passion and our livelihood. So there are benefits on that side. There are also benefits in that every time there is a conflict, there's also an opportunity to deal with it well, to deal with it constructively in this new way that we know about and that we're trying to teach others about and to lead others through when we're in, let's say, in the mediation room. But nevertheless, the fundamental truth. Think about the societies we live in. Again, right now on our table, I can put Israel, the United States, and Brazil. 3 polarized societies that are literally, not figuratively, literally on fire sometimes. And sometimes I mean in the past, this year, the past year in Brazil, in Israel, 3 years ago in the United States. And so my thoughts on this is that we need to find a way to live up to something that, as a teacher, I've heard so many times, and maybe those of you who are studying it now have had this moment of clarity, where a student walks up to me and he says, yeah, I mean, we're in law school and I'm learning mediation, let's say, to help me as a lawyer, but this stuff isn't just good for my professional work. This is, I use this everywhere. I use this in every part of my life. And then they reach the conclusion, everyone should know this. Everybody needs this. And think about the world if everyone in the world, and forgive me, I can be a little bit of a hippie and a little bit of a dreamer, but I'm not the only one. Think of if everyone in the world, or even 10% of the people in the world, knew just a little bit more about addressing conflict constructively. What a change that might bring in the world. And so for the past 2 years, I've been looking at projects, thinking about how can we reach large numbers, large scales of people. I'm a professor nowadays, right? I teach 100, 200, maybe 300 students in a year when I'm doing a lot of training. So what does the number come up to? Another 1,000 people, another 2,000 people. There are 8 billion people in the world. Now, I know I don't have to reach them all on my own, but you get the numbers. We need to work at a much larger scale. So I've done a couple of projects, like a project teaching a large scale course on the internet that was open to anybody who'd want to learn it. I wrote a book for the Chinese market, because there were not appropriate textbooks for studying negotiation in certain aspects. So thinking again just about the scale of numbers of people who might read it. And then it hit me, together with Professor Jen Reynolds, my partner on this book, that we've reached that point at which both we need to teach the world, and we both realize that we share 2 passions. And one of those passions is for teaching the world, and the other is for pop culture, and particularly Star Wars. And what we discussed is that, I'm never going to bring 1 million people into a room in order to listen to me speak about conflict. But there are phenomena that have millions and millions of of people as a ready-made audience. And, think about these pop culture phenomena that, it could be a movie, a TV show, a series that have millions of people just waiting to know anything more about it. They'll read any article on the internet about it. They'll try to learn more about the actors, about the directors, about when is the next coming over. And some of them will also want to listen to anything that is even tangentially connected to it. So there are these things out there with ready-made audience in the millions. How could we connect those ready-made audiences to conflict resolution? And our answer was, if we could sort of connect the vehicle of conflict resolution to the engine of pop culture, that might lead to this mass improvement in conflict understanding, conflict literacy. And so here we are. We decided to start with Star Wars because, as I opened up, that's where both Jen and I began, and that's what we've been doing. We gathered a group of over 20 people from all around the conflict resolution field and asked if they would write chapters. In fact, we received many more proposals from others who wanted to be there, but we could only fit so many in the book we put out. And I'll say that sort of when talking about the outputs, so the first output of the project is a book. We started with books because we're both professors. So, right, you start with the thing you know. I'm not likely to be a movie star, and I'm also unlikely to be a TikTok sensation. So, start in your area. But still, the first book that we put out is a book, and Fernando showed it, Star Wars and Conflict Resolution. There are alternatives to fighting, and the thing behind the book is we had 20 people write chapters on their area of expertise from all sorts of disciplines, and we wrote it in a way that it could be enjoyed by professionals, experts in conflict, lawyers, managers, people who work in this, but also that it can be enjoyed by people who have nothing to do professionally with conflict or its resolution. And actually, the book was written for them. So even though any mediator can pick it up and learn a lot of it, because there's so much in there that goes beyond any course I've ever taught on mediation, and I'm pretty sure beyond the course that some of you are studying now, but there's so much more in them. But the book, as I said, it was really it's meant for the public, and it's meant for people. Hopefully, I would hope that, let's say, a mediator who would read it and they say, oh, there's so much about conflict in it, and then buy it for their nephew or their child and saying, look, I know you don't want to hear me talking about my job at home, but if Han Solo or Darth Vader were talking about it, would you listen to them? And I mean, it's wonderful. Now my family knows what I do. Before, when I tell them I was a mediator, they'd say, oh, wait, so like you're some kind of lawyer, but not really. Is that right? And I'd say, okay, let's start from the top. I'll explain this again. But they don't ask me anymore. So in this book, there are chapters on all of the basic conflict topics, and there are chapters on the main processes. So there's a chapter on negotiation, and a chapter on mediation, a chapter on arbitration, chapter on communication, a couple of side chapters mainly on negotiation. And right now, what we're working on, since we see this is a project, it's not just a book that we put out and now we're moving on. So first of all, it's true Star Wars tradition. We're working on episode 2 already. And I'm reading chapters right now, and Jen is also editing chapters for episode 2, which will be out, let's say it'll be out in less than a year, but I'm not going to make any promises. And the other thing that we're doing in order to spread this out into the world is where we're going to unusual places for us. Like, we're used to teaching classrooms and going to academic or professional conferences, and we still do that, and talking about this, trainings and courses and talks like this. But we're also going to find fans where they are. So we've been going to Comic-Cons, which are pop culture conventions, and giving presentations there, seeing if we were right, that if we dressed conflict resolution up in, let's say, Star Wars, and connected those two, would fans come to hear about it? And we've been blown away that absolutely, these are huge conferences, much bigger than any conference you've ever been to on mediation or negotiation. And we've given talks in rooms with hundreds of people in them, not because they were getting credit or ongoing education. They just were interested, and it's been a fascinating trip so far. And what we hope to do is two things. One is that Star Wars is only the thing we started with because of our own love for it. When you think about it, there are so many other pop culture phenomena out there, and you could write an anything and conflict resolution. I mean, pick your favorite, whatever fan you are of a book, of a movie, of a series, whether it's Lord of the Rings in conflict resolution, or Game of Thrones in conflict resolution, or whatever is huge in Brazil, or whatever you love. That could be most of these shows can be a book, an conflict resolution book, and we have every intention of doing those, because each one of those is a bridge to a new group of people who could then learn more about conflict. And so one thing I want to invite you, those who are not necessarily Star Wars fans, is as we go along and give examples and tell stories and talk about conflict, if the Star Wars content doesn't speak to you, then think to yourself, okay, but how would that concept play out in the series that I like? How would it play out in Game of Thrones? Or if I'm a Friends fan, or a Harry Potter fan, or a whatever, a Shakespeare fan, it doesn't matter, right? So translate that to you, and you'll start feeling the magic of the connection between pop culture and conflict resolution. So that is all in ways of introduction. Fernanda, if it's okay, I mean, I'm happy to stop now if you have comments or there are comments from the audience, or I could jump into a conflict topic and start talking Star Wars and conflict. What would work here? Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. 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 You know, thank you. That was the hardest part of writing this book, was deciding what was in and what was out. Well, first of all, the fundamental approach was, in terms of knowing enough about Star Wars and enough about conflict, Jen and I could have written this on our own together. And then we wouldn't have had to make those hard decisions. We just decide what's the table of contents. But we really wanted many voices in this. And we really wanted voices not just from our area, but from psychology. You know, I'm a post lawyer, and Jen is a professor in a law school, and conflict is such a inter and multi and transdisciplinary area. So we wanted people with multiple points of view. And that also meant that people would be writing things that we would never have thought about. And so it's hard to decide ahead of time what should be in the book. So we asked people for their ideas, give us, you know, and then we were blown away because we received, you know, thinking, you know, we're not such a huge field. We're not like the field of psychology, right? That you have hundreds of thousands of people in academia and millions in practice, right? Or at least hundreds of thousands in practice. It's a small field, but we found ourselves receiving dozens and dozens of proposals. It turns out that there are a lot more geeks in our field than we knew existed, and that's delightful. We had hoped to tap that, to uncover that, and so we needed to choose. It made a lot of hard choices, particularly because we didn't want to reject any of the proposals. All the proposals were fine. Some were better than others or written better than others, but that wasn't the point. All of them could have been good chapters. And so for this first book, we decided that what we wanted to do is we wanted to give a very basic introduction to the topics of negotiation and conflict and its resolution. And so it needed to be more of an introductory book than a book talking about a lot of interesting ideas related to conflict, we needed to put the ground floor in first. And once the ground floor would be in first, then in later books, we'd have more room for, for more complex or more, different ideas that aren't, this is negotiation, this is mediation. Let me introduce you to these fundamental topics. So we went with the basics in this book. Of course, we reached far beyond the basics, but that was what we were thinking as we were structuring. So in the end, we accepted more of those chapters that were on this basic level. And so the book, as you said, it has conflict and resolution. So it has an introduction to main topics on the conflict side, conflict dynamics, the role of emotions on conflict, the role of our psychological biases in conflict, conflict escalation, and how that works. And to give people who, we're all in conflict so much of the time, but we don't name what we're doing, and that is. And I think that addresses this last comment in the chat. Sort of what was the fundamental direction you were taking, and that's exactly it. How can we help people recognize and name these very basic things that go on in our lives when we're in conflict, and give them a language to use? And once you're a little more literate in conflict, once you can talk about it, you recognize the basic dynamics, you can start thinking, oh, I'm falling into this trap. This is my bias speaking. This is my, this is my anger now that's in charge, and it's not my rational approach. Or this is my overly logical approach that's getting us messed up, and I'm not letting emotion into the room. So once we have this sort of lexicon, this shared language, so people can start thinking about these things themselves. So that's on the conflict side. And on the resolution side, there was that, and in addition, as I said, introducing the basic processes that, that many people in the room here, it's our day-to-day life, and trying to simplify them, so that people can recognize that actually everybody goes through all those processes themselves. We negotiate all the time. We mediate far more than we think, right? Not formally, but we mediate far more than we think. We are in mediation far more often than we think. We're not in a room that says mediation on the front. We're not diplomats sitting down to resolve the world's problems. But, we're often in a situation with someone, and there's a third person in the room who's doing something to help us work it out. So we're all in these roles all of the time. And that, and knowing a little bit more about that is going to help us. Another, just in one chapter that came, again, from a realm that we didn't know about or hadn't considered, is from the area of something called meetings science. It's in the realm of either industrial organizational psychology or social psychology, depending, or management. But the notion of, we spend so much of our time in meetings, right? So how can you think about meetings as a unit of analysis? How do we tend to behave in meetings? What are the patterns of conflict or conflict resolution that play out in meetings? As a science that we'd never considered. Now, of course, negotiation sessions are usually, meetings of a form, whether we call them that or not. Mediation meetings are meetings, but we usually use the mediation perspective to talk about it, and not the meetings perspective. And here we have three meetings scientists writing a chapter about the science of meetings and how that impacts conflict resolution. And think about it. Think about meetings that we see in Star Wars, right? So we have all those times that the rebels gather around the table, right? And they see the 3D version. This is the bad Death Star. This is how we're going to blow up. And then people start pitching in. And that's one dynamic of meetings. Notice how it's democratic. Everybody feels that they can comment, including to say, this will never work, right? And then consider meetings on the empire side of things, right? And you see people getting thrown around, being force choked, very hierarchical. And those are two fundamentally different approaches to meetings and then to decision makings. And they say a lot about the organization, of course. And it's not so much that one is better than the other, but obviously they're going to have different dynamics and they're going to reach different outcomes. So there's a lot to learn from that. So that's like one example of both of the content of the book, but also of the really new sources of input that the book offered. Yeah. Right. Mm. I know, right? And when I read that proposal, it made me feel well. I had two strong reactions. One of them is one I shared with you in our talks before this, which is how when you asked me about my favorite character, I shared one thing in that growing up as a child, all of the people I identified as my favorite characters, they were all male. And it only hit me about 10 years ago that, that I passed over such powerful role models, the female role models in Star Wars, just because of sort of being, locked into my gender identification with males and looking for them as role models. And here, when you look at Star Wars, the female leaders in Star Wars are so much better in every possible way than the male heroes. I mean, of course, I come from the brand of feminism, which is we're all in this together and we all need each other. But when you look at it from a critical perspective, you see the women are the ones who are planning. The women are the ones who are bringing people together. The women are the ones who are both taking care of the relationships, but also they're the ones making the plans and making sure that we have the information we need in order to make the plans and that the information is in the right place at the right time. So there's no distinction, like we have in our world, or, we're trying to break out of that, but sort of the women are in charge of the relationships and the men are in charge of the tasks or of the substance, the problems with the modern day the modern day workplace, which is sort of the right below the surface. You don't see any of that in Star Wars. You see the women they're making the decisions. The women are the ones who are doing both the substance and maintaining the relationships. And meanwhile, the men are sort of running off on their own, blowing things up sort of randomly. Think about Han Solo's decision-making process, right? Or his answer to everything is to pull his blaster and start shooting, which is a good thing to do, probably in his world, right? 50% of the time, but not all the time. And yet he does it 50% of the time. Luke, who, lots of people identify with in so many ways, is also, he's also headstrong, and he's also, he doesn't see the big picture. He doesn't necessarily take strategic considerations into account. Sometimes he doesn't take relationships into account, and other times he gets lost in relationships and only takes relationships into account. And so when you think about that sort of comparison between the genders in Star Wars, there's a lot to learn if we want to learn about how we might act constructively in our own world. There is a lot more to learn from the women of Star Wars than there is from the men of Star Wars. Now, of course, that's not true for everyone, and there are a lot of men with, who give good examples, but also, as we know in the world of conflict, you can use bad examples just as well as you can use good examples in order to teach, right? That was Yoda in episode 8 saying, right, the greatest teacher failure is, right? So a bad example, an example of a negotiation that went wrong, or a conflict action that backfired, is just as good for teaching purposes as a good example. So when we analyze Star Wars in the book, so it doesn't matter if it turned out to be that one of the characters made a good negotiation move or a bad negotiation move. We can analyze either of those and learn from them. And to be fair, there are more bad negotiation moves in Star Wars than there are good negotiations. If Star Wars was full of helpful, constructive, well thought out strategic negotiation moves, maybe we wouldn't even have to write the book, because anybody watching the movie would recognize that this is good negotiation, right? Okay, so I'll just be like, Princess Leia, and I'll negotiate like Padme. I'll negotiate in my day-to-day like Padme negotiates her diplomatic negotiations and everything. No, but most of the negotiations in Star Wars ultimately fail. But there's a lesson in every one of them. And so one thing, I'll just point out one last thing about this chapter. Since I mentioned episode 8. So in episode 8, there's those who remember, who've seen the movie in The Last Jedi, there was a conflict between Poe, the resistance fighter pilot, who's like a headstrong, very talented, very sharp, but very headstrong and impulsive member of the resistance. And the leader who steps in when Princess Leia is injured, Admiral Holdo. And they get into a dispute that is very, very sharp. And it's unusual to see two people on the same team get into a dispute that sharp on the Rebel Alliance Jedi side of things. We see that all the time on the dark side of things, those kind of fights, but you don't see it on the Rebel Alliance kind of thing. So it immediately caught everybody's eye. This is unusual, and it was an ongoing thing. And of course, there's so much to talk about that, both in Star Wars and out, because essentially what you had there, and I know, and I'm saying this, also in the context of people studying and practicing as judges and mediators in labor contexts, because essentially that was a workplace dispute, right? And there was an organization. It was a workplace. They weren't arguing over salary. They were arguing over strategy, and they were arguing over chain of command, and they were arguing about the success or failure of the enterprise. But basically, you had basically either two members of the C-suite, or one member of the C-suite and one middle management. They had a fierce dispute. It was held in front of many other line employees. I mean, it was a workplace dispute. And it also matched a lot of what we see in modern workplaces along gender lines. In other words, when you look at that scene, you ask yourself, wait, is Poe responding so strongly to Holdo because he disagrees with her strategy? Or is he just treating her differently than he would treat a male counterpart? So sure, he had gotten used to Leia being in charge, so it's not as if he'd never worked for a woman before, but he never listened to her, right? She would tell him, do this, and he'd go off and do what he wanted. And here is this new person who is not going to let him get away with it. And he responds to her very sharply. And you start to wonder, well, if it had been a man, would he respond in that way? And so looking into that scene, you can then start to think about all sorts of workplace conflicts that you might have seen in your life, or you have friends who have been through. And you start to recognize, the real world playing out in Star Wars, and Star Wars playing out in our real world. And there are insights in there that can help us to do better in these situations. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Um, you know that at this moment I'm seeing, like you said, you're sitting with 5 screens in front of you. 5 screens just opened up in my mind of different scenes from the movie, from the movies, and I'm trying to sort of so one thing that comes to mind is that the movie opens. When I say the movie opens, of course I mean episode 4, the first one in the series. It opens with a struggle to communicate a message, right? That's what the whole first movie is about. It's communicating a message, and then it's about bringing information from one place to another, which is another form of communicating a message. But the whole first part of the movie is getting Princess Leia's plea to Obi-Wan Kenobi, getting it to Obi-Wan Kenobi. And think about the first 45 minutes of Star Wars. We see droids complaining their way across the desert, right? Meeting Luke, running away from Luke, doing all sorts of things, all in this effort to bring a message from person A to person B. The message is conveyed holographically, right? There's the famous scene of "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope," by hologram. So, of course, we could talk about online communication and the role of technology in all of this. But even if we set that apart for even just a moment, think about all the efforts that Princess Leia and then R2-D2 and then C-3PO and Luke and then Obi-Wan Kenobi and then all the efforts they went through just in order to transfer a message from person A to person B. And I've always thought that both as a metaphor and literally, that is the struggle that we always face. I say something now, Fernando, and you hear me, right? I say something and the audience hears me. But actually we're communicating through filters. And sometimes these filters are internal or innate. They're the filters in our minds, right? The way we see the world, the languages we speak, the way we speak. The way we spoke about language before this call, setting up the translation and just our own experience with languages. So of course we have all of these filters that get in the way to some extent of the pure meaning that I'm trying to transmit, and it's the potential for it to reach you in that very same way is probably zero, right? There's no chance that you are going to hear my intent just as I had intended, and that's in face-to-face regular communication. Please don't think I know that Simone and Amanda, who are handling the translation for us, are doing an amazing job of getting the message across. But that's one more filter that we work through. So, but even when there are no interpretations going on and we're all speaking the same language, those same challenges we face them. We're just less aware of them because there's not an interpreter in the room or on the Zoom call. So that's one thing. And so much gets lost through these translations. I think it was George Bernard Shaw who said that the greatest mistake we have about good communication is the notion that this ever takes place, something along those lines. So we're always working uphill, as we say. It's always a challenge, and in Star Wars the challenge continues. So then the rest of that first movie is the challenge of getting information from point A to point B when people are trying to interfere with that information, right? So that's the rest of the first movie. They're trying to get the Death Star plans R2D2 or from the Death Star, trying to get them to the Rebel Alliance. That's also the plot of I don't know, part of the 7th movie, trying to get the location of Luke Skywalker, that information back to the Resistance. The same in Episode 9, trying to get the location of Exegol, the planet where the Emperor is hiding, trying to get that. So there's a lot of, how do we get information? How do we find information? And then how do we convey it? And that's what we do all the time as negotiators and as mediators. So even when you think of just the highest level of the movies are about our lives in that sense. Of course, to sort of zoom in more specifically, the movies all show the importance of good communication, particularly in negotiation and mediation. Let me focus on negotiation processes, because here's the thing. I think I hinted at this before. Most of the negotiation scenes in the movies are unsuccessful, and part of the reason they're unsuccessful is because the parties doing them are not very good communicators. Part of the reason they're not very good communicators is they don't think that they need to be very good communicators. And yes, I'm talking about the Jedi now, right? The Jedi, the heroes who can, they can do anything. But think about all of those situations in which Jedi try to negotiate in the movies. So think about the scene, let's say in Episode 6, Return of the Jedi. Luke Skywalker is trying to save Han Solo, right? Han Solo is frozen up on the wall of Jabba the Hutt. Oh, thank you. Perfect. And here I was, I said, let's not use my presentation. Let's just, and here you are flashing the scenes up. So, right. So Luke Skywalker comes and he starts negotiating with Jabba. And at first, he does a very good job when he sends the message, a recorded message. He says, "Exalted One, let's work together. We can both profit." Just as we, textbook as we learned. But then he walks into the room. And the first thing he did is he waved his hand. A Jedi can alter their counterpart's perception of reality, and cause them to think things that they hadn't known they were thinking, cause them to agree with them. It plays with the other's mind. So the Jedi are used to waving their hands and saying, "You will bring Captain Solo and the Wookiee to me," right? Unfortunately for the Jedi mind trick doesn't work on everybody. It only works on the weak-minded. And I think there's a lot to say, like in our world, and there's a chapter on this in the book, written by Scott Maravilla. There are a lot of, thank you. There are a lot of manipulations that people try to do when communicating in negotiation, but they don't work as often as we think they do. And in fact, when they don't work, and the person, think about times that people have manipulated you, right? Imagine if that stormtrooper at the checkpoint hadn't said, these aren't the droids we're looking for, hadn't said move along, but instead say, "Hey man, what are you trying to pull? Stop waving your hand," right? If the stormtrooper had known what was going on, he would have been angry, like Watu and Qui-Gon, exactly. Qui-Gon tried to get a discount by waving his hand around, and tried to get his preferred currency. It didn't work on Watu. Watu took it sort of in good humor. He didn't get angry at Qui-Gon. He said, "What are you waving your hand around? What are you, some kind of Jedi? Just pay me the money I want." He didn't get angry. But think about times that you've been manipulated, everybody. It makes us angry. So naturally, when Luke is there in Jabba's throne room, and it doesn't work on Jabba, doesn't My interests are getting Captain Solo and his friends out safely, protecting my friends. And also we have this Death Star to destroy, right? We have business to take care of. So obviously it's very important for me to get Captain Solo. He's my ride out of here. So what are your interests? How can I help you? He doesn't say any of that. What he says is, nevertheless, I'm taking Captain Solo and the Wookiee with me. You can either profit from this or be destroyed. And then when Jabba says there will be no bargain, we've all had parties tell us, no, I don't agree to that. Do we do what Luke did? What did Luke do? He reached out, he stole someone's blaster, and he aimed it at Jabba, right? Well, maybe we might be a little more aggressive if we were facing Jabba the Hutt. Okay, so fair enough. But the point being that the Jedi, since they relied on their magical powers, so to speak, their training did not involve good communication, listening, asking questions, reframing the no into a potential yes. He didn't think about how might, if Jabba says, that only works on the weak-minded, your Jedi mind trick won't work on me. He didn't think about reframing that into, clearly you're an intelligent creature, Jabba, and you and I are going to sit down and work this out like two intelligent beings. No. Instead, he defaulted to violence. And this is something that the Jedi did throughout the entire saga. And I think that when we think about our world, so this is, lots of people say, oh, I want to know how to negotiate like a Jedi, the Jedi magic. No, what we need to learn is what the Jedis need to learn, which is how do you negotiate, how do you communicate well when you don't have magic, when you don't have the Force working for you, when you can't do the Jedi mind trick? What are the ways in which we can still affect the other's mindset, learn their interests, persuade them to do something they hadn't intended to do? So in that sense, so much of the movie is either about good communication sometimes and really, really poor communication other times. And just as a last line that popped into my mind, towards the end of the trilogy, of the prequel trilogy, like the early, episodes 1 to 3, this war has been brewing throughout the 3 movies, and suddenly it comes to be. And Padme says this war represents a failure to listen. That's her summary of the war. That's the summary of the root cause of the war. And I think about that, my experiences in the mediation room. It's so often that this mediation represents a failure to listen. Parties could have worked this out on their own, but it's really, really hard to work things out on your own. A, when you're not trained in that, and B, when there's a conflictual atmosphere around you of distrust, of opponents. It's really tough. Yes, it is. Yeah. No problem. On the contrary, I'm happy to go completely off presentation and off script. Yeah, yeah. Sure. So either leave that screen or okay, let's work with your screen. I have my own slide in mind, but I prefer working on your turf. So because if I speak on my own slides, then I'll get lost in the slides, and if we speak on your slide, then I'll actually relate directly to your question. So the question then arises, based on everything we've said so far, how can we help as mediators if negotiation is so hard, if good communication is so hard? How can we as mediators help parties to be, to negotiate just a little better, to communicate just a little better? Because sometimes that's all we need. And I found that this tool, this conflict modes tool, is very, very helpful for mediators to keep in mind always. Because here's the thing, that the conflict modes model says the following, and it's pretty well accepted in conflict studies. It's not axiomatic, but it's pretty well accepted that all of us as individuals, when we're engaged in conflict, when we find ourselves in a conflict or a conflict-like situation, we default to one particular mode of interacting with the other. We default to behaving in a certain pattern of thinking and acting, no matter what the context is. And this is very important to say. In other words, when we're in conflict, we generally respond by acting X. And Thomas and Kilman, a couple of years before Star Wars, the first movie came out, they put out this conflict modes model, which looked at two personality features. They looked at how assertive one's personality tends to be in conflict, and how cooperative one's. If you think about those two terms, they're not clashing terms. They're just different. They're different aspects of one's personality, and they charted out 4 or 5 primary modes to which people defaulted in conflict. So it's easiest to say this, to start this, by thinking not about ourselves, but thinking about other people, right? It's like with many psychological concepts, it's much easier to identify it on the outside first, and then we can bring it in. So I think that we all know one person who is always who is very competitive. Like anything you say, they'll say the opposite. Anytime you ask them for something, they'll say, no, I'm not going to give it to you, or no, I'm not going to give it to you, and I want yours also. Now, it might be, our older sibling that we have in mind. It might be someone at work. It might be a friend. But you have someone in mind when I said that. And one of the important words here is always, that they're always that way, or almost always, okay? We all know someone who is always accommodating, by which I mean they always give in. Like if a conflict arises, they always say, like if there are 9 people sitting at a table around a pizza pie and there are 8 slices of pizza, then there's one person who says, no, I won't eat, right? They're accommodating, they accommodate the other. And when, thanks for putting that up, perfect. And they behave that way in conflict also. If someone says, this is the price of the car, take it or leave it, they'll say, okay, I'll take it, and they'll pay, rather than say, you know what, that's a lot. I'll pay you less. They default to a, some of us try to avoid conflict. In other words, it's not that we try to give in, it's just that we try not to be involved at all. And others of us tend to be cooperative by nature. In other words, when we're in a conflict-like situation, our first instinctive action is to try and figure out, wait, might there be some way we can, is there really a fight here? Can we just work together and solve it? And these are our default modes. And the important thing is that they govern so much of how we act in conflict without us making an intentional choice about how do we want to act in this conflict. Because what Thomas Kilman essentially says is that this is a matter of our personality. It's not a matter of our logical thinking in a situation. No, It's that we tend to be competitive. So we tend to be competitive across all or nearly all situations. Now, there are many situations in life in which being competitive serves us well. But there are many situations in life in which being competitive, and by being competitive means trying to get everything you need without caring about whether the other gets anything that they need, right? Or sometimes wanting to do the other harm in order to get what you need, or sometimes wanting to do someone harm just for the fun of it, or just because you can along the way. Because think about real conflicts that you've been in. Sometimes you see harm to the other as a benefit to yourself, even though economically it's not necessarily that way, right? I just think about that sometimes there's a space that goes even off this chart, that it's not even about our benefit anymore. It's about harm to the other. Think about mediations you've seen in which you realize parties aren't even acting. They've passed the point of trying to get the best deal they can for themselves. They're just trying to screw the other. Like they've either given up what they were here to get, or they've achieved whatever it is. They've stopped seeing themselves. Now they only see the other, and they want to hurt them. And so that's extreme competition, of course, but it's very real in our mediation rooms. And of course, in our mediation training teaches us to look along the line of collaboration, of how we can work together. And if that's not possible, then perhaps how can we compromise? How can we split things in the middle? So yeah, we don't all get everything, but at least we get something. Maybe at least we get enough. And something that's very helpful to know before we even start working along that is that people's personalities are wired to either act in a helpful way with that or act against that. And so when we now walk into a mediation room, we're able to recognize we're not psychologists and we're not personality experts, and we shouldn't label people very quickly, okay? But usually after around, listening to people for around 15, 20 minutes in a mediation room, I think we can all get a first sense, this might be a competitive personality. This might be a conflict avoidant personality. This might be a collaborative personality. And that is such helpful information to use in the mediation room. So let's take that and set it aside for a moment. And you know what, Fernando, could I actually ask you to put that slide back? Because I want you to consider this not only as a personality chart, but also as a strategy chart. Because in the mediation room, what we try to do so often is we try to suggest to parties who are in conflict with each other, which means they are usually both adopting a competitive stance towards one another. We ask them to choose a different stance. We ask them to look at collaboration or cooperation. So we're asking them sometimes to move away from their default and to act a different way. So if you ask a collaborative person to be collaborative, that's one thing. If you ask a competitive person to be collaborative, that's quite another thing, okay? And so, good, and it's even better that we have a different slide here so we can look at this a little differently. Instead of looking at this as a personality chart, let's look at this as a strategy chart, right? There are times when it's helpful for us to compete, even if we're collaborators by nature, right? There are times when collaborating won't work, or it won't be beneficial, or the other simply won't cooperate with us. So that might be a situation in which we should either compete or avoid strategically, even though by nature we'd love to collaborate. If we try to collaborate with someone who insists on competing with us, we're going to pay a price for that. Certainly if we always accommodate someone who's going to compete with us, we're going to pay a price for that. So there are times when it pays for us to step out of our personality, to unhook, right? Ray from the sequel trilogy would call this to bypass the compressor our inner workings that lead us to cooperate or collaborate, whatever it is, and stop cooperating, but instead compete strategically, or stop competing and instead collaborate. So let me show one example from Star Wars, and then we can talk about it more in mediation. So can I share my screen now? Okay. And so I'm just going to go jump ahead. And so, as Fernando said, at the personality level, we have these different personalities. Anakin Skywalker is the most, even as a child. I mean, Fernando, you said you loved him, right? People love Anakin as a child, but he was a very competitive child, right? Remember the pod race. He gave freely. He wasn't greedy, but he was very competitive. C-3PO is always accommodating by personality, by his programming. He's always looking to surrender to someone. Luke's uncle always avoids. He says, I don't want to get involved, right? I don't want Luke to go to the academy because then he'll be part of the war. I didn't want Obi-Wan Kenobi to go fight in the wars because I don't agree with his ideology. And then you have that scene where Luke explains to Obi-Wan Kenobi, I can't go with you. I can't go with you to Alderaan. It's so far away. I have lots of work. My uncle's... And he says all these excuses. And then Obi-Wan Kenobi tells him, that's your uncle talking. So that is Uncle Owen's... that's his nature. One of the characters from the sequels, Finn, the stormtrooper turned resistance fighter, is a collaborator. If you watch him through the movies, he always works with someone else. He never works alone. And if you, in this first movie where he first meets Rey, it's highly symbolic. He keeps offering her his hand or grabbing her hand. And since she's such a loner, she has no idea why he keeps taking her hand. It's a very strange gesture to her. And of course, that says a world about, her nature at first and her what, and it says a lot about culture, and it says a lot about how we communicate and what norms are. But think about Finn when they asked him, hey, join the resistance against the First Order. He said, no, we're not going to the resistance base to fight the First Order. We need to run. And so Finn is a natural collaborator, but there's this situation where he thought about, should we fight the First Order? No, the First Order can't be beaten. Strategically, it would be ridiculous to take part in this fight. And so I prefer to avoid this conflict instead of collaborate with my counterparts in order to compete with the First Order. So Finn strategically decided to run, even though his instinct might have been to collaborate with the alliance, or the resistance, as they were called then. And finally, I'd like to give an example that works along those lines, and also shows us about the shift from working in a positional manner, like parties often do in the room, like this is my position, this is my position, to shifting to talking about interests. And interestingly, the person who gives this example is the most competitive person in Star Wars, as I said, Anakin Skywalker / Darth Vader. Notice, by the way, that I said person. Anakin is the most competitive person. I don't know whether he's the most competitive figure in Star Wars, because R2-D2 is also wildly competitive. We just don't notice it because he's cute, right? It's easier to know that Darth Vader, right? Darth Vader, it's easier to know that he's a fierce, fighty competitor, always trying to get in your way, because that's what he looks like and that's how he always acts. He doesn't beep, beep, beep and roll around. So in this famous scene, I'll set up, Vader has kidnapped Leia and Han and Chewbacca, and he's torturing Han. And it just so Luke Skywalker will feel it in the Force and come rescue him. It's a trap for Luke. And so Luke comes to Cloud City. This is in the Empire, comes back, and they fight. And so they fight with lightsaber. Luke is hardly trained as a Jedi. He's trained for like 20 minutes as a Jedi. And Darth Vader has been, he's been doing this all his life. And so their fight isn't much of a fight. And it's, and they both tend competitive at first. They start fighting. And within a few minutes, I think, it was only drawn out to be theatrical. And I think Vader was having fun, toying with Luke. But he very quickly beat Luke. And then when Luke continued to resist, Vader disarmed him by both, knocking away his lightsaber and cutting off his arm, setting up a Star Wars tradition of this is how we do things in Star Wars. And so Luke is fully beaten. So think about this from the point of view of a competitor. This is the moment at which he, plunges his lightsaber into Luke's face and kills him, and he's won. The competitor has absolute victory, which is what competitors by nature try to achieve. But here's the thing. Vader wasn't out to kill an enemy. So while every bit of his nature might be, telling him, push the lightsaber ahead, he's also saying, no, the reason I need Luke is because I need to turn him to the dark side and make him into an ally and a servant of the Emperor, and, and maybe other things. So he knows that competition won't get him there. He can't fight Luke into being a servant of the dark side. That doesn't work. Sometimes we can, you can't beat someone into being your partner. What you can do is you can beat them, and we often do this, and you'll see this in business and in workplaces, and in other areas of life, is that sometimes we need to twist people's arms just a little in order to get them to the table. Because until they felt a little bit of the pain of either the pain that we're feeling or the pain of being without an agreement or the pain of being without communication, they don't know that they have an interest, or they refuse to recognize that they have an interest in communicating and working things out. So sometimes there's that you need to up the heat a little bit in order to get them to the table. But once you have them at the table, if you continue to twist their arm, you're making a mistake, right? And that's what Vader recognized. And so suddenly Vader starts talking basically like the most interest-based negotiator you would ever meet. And he starts thinking about Luke's interests, just like we think about parties' interests in the mediation room. There was no mediator there, or the mediator might have done a slightly better job. We'll get to that. But look at Vader from this moment on in the scene. He puts his lightsaber, he lowers his lightsaber, and he says to Luke, join me and I'll complete your training. So he's offering Luke to satisfy two interests. One is, you don't have a lot of friends, right? I'll offer you belong to something. You've always wanted to belong to something. That's one. I will complete your training. You want to be trained in the ways of the Force. You need a teacher. I know you don't have a teacher, parentheses, because I killed him in the last movie. So obviously you need someone to train him. So I can satisfy that interest of yours. I can satisfy another interest of yours. Wouldn't you like to end this destructive conflict? Wouldn't you like to bring order to the galaxy? Wouldn't you want to be the person who brought peace and stopped this galactic civil war? Wouldn't that be great? Wouldn't you want to be that person? You hate the Emperor, right? You can destroy him. I'll teach you how. We don't know whether he meant that or not, but he's saying it as one of Luke's interests. If you join me, I'll teach you how. Again, join me in affiliation, and two more things. Together, again, the joint affiliation word, join me, and together we can rule the galaxy. Don't you want power? Isn't that an interest of yours? To be a powerful person, to rule the galaxy, to have everything go as you wish? And we'll do it as father and son. Haven't you always missed not having a father? Haven't you been looking for a father figure in Uncle Owen and in Ben Kenobi, and maybe in Han Solo, or maybe in Yoda? Haven't you been looking for this? I can satisfy all of those interests. So it's amazing that from the moment he's vanquished Luke physically, Vader only talks about interests and not about positions. He never says, you need to turn. You need to, you need to be an Emperor's servant. You need to belong to the dark side. None of that. It's all interest-based. Now, this is the disappointed face of a father who's done everything that he possibly could to help his son make a good decision, and still his son threw himself down a bottomless pit and didn't listen to him. So you can see the disappointment on the mask. He's not listening again. But you know, the beauty of what Vader did here is how he did it. He only focused on interest. Now, I think that as mediators, we also need to know why sometimes interest-based conversations don't work. And one reason for that is because, right, so we need to be like not only to recognize why parties are negotiating poorly, let's say because their conflict modes are both competitive. We also need to figure out when interest-based negotiation isn't working, why isn't it working? And what we might see here from the outside is that the reason it didn't work might be because Vader doesn't really know Luke's interests. He's guessing. And we often guess the other party's interests, or as mediators, we often guess parties' interests. And that'll take us, you know, that's potentially a, you know, either a good start or something that we can do if parties aren't responsive. We can start to think what might be their interest, but we need to be tentative. We need to be cautious because we don't know. And we should always follow it up with the question, like, are those your interests, right? Would you like to rule the galaxy together? Are you looking for a father? Like, you've been looking for a teacher. Is that important to you, right? Like, it's not saying, I know you need a teacher, so I'm going to make my offer. No, it's first learn the interest and then make the offer. And Vader didn't ask a single question here. And I think that sort of the mediator in me and the mediators here in the room were looking at that at first and saying, okay, he's actually negotiating in a surprisingly good way, but he didn't ask a single question. He guessed, and actually everything Vader offered Luke was not a primary interest of Luke. Luke cared about his friends, right? He cared about his friends and their survival. He didn't want to work against the Alliance. He thought Vader was a monster, even if he's discovered that he's just his father. You know, I might have been looking for a father figure my whole life, but it's not some monster dressed up in black armor who chokes people for the fun of it and tortures my friends in order to bring me here. What were you thinking, Dad? And surprised Vader. Vader thought he had no alternative, and Luke showed him, I have an alternative of saying no. Those aren't my interests. Don't want to work with you. Shalom, right? So that is both sort of Vader as showing us how you can change from competition to cooperation strategically. It's showing us how you can use interest-based instead of positional negotiation, even if you are a very positional and competitive person. And along the way, it's a lesson in how to do better at that. Right. There you go. Let me pause just for a moment and just respond in 2 sentences to Obi-Wan Kenobi dressed up as a negotiator. And I just want to say this. Oh, perfect. I just want to say that when we're talking about personality types, it's interesting. You think that if I have my personality type, then basically that's what I'm going to be my whole life. And really, developmental psychologists tell us that our personality is largely set, as children. And then the rest of our lives, we make tiny movement, right? But by age 5, it's all over, right? But I think that many people say that that's true. We only make small changes, but over time, we can become quite different people. And I think that Obi-Wan is the model for that. Think about young Obi-Wan versus old Obi-Wan. They are the same person, but they're also different. And I think that thinking about when we're thinking about who we want to be with regard to conflict, there's how we want to act in this moment, but there's also who we want to be long term. And I think that Obi-Wan offers us hope, the hope that we can grow to be more than we once were. And of course, Obi-Wan is a wonderful, both a Jedi and a fantastic negotiator, fantastic all sorts of things as a young person. But he's so much more. As he grows older, he grows wiser, he grows more humble, he grows less dependent. Anyway, it's just a fascinating transition. He's a much better teacher. I've noticed this as a teacher. Think about Obi-Wan teaching Luke and Obi-Wan teaching Anakin. It's two completely different people doing the teaching there. And so I think that this offers hope that we can change. But I do want to then jump to your question on the emotional level. So here's one thing that became popular in certain forums, particularly in the 1980s. It was, as the Terminator movies were coming out, it was popular to include negotiation, to talk about negotiation trainings. And, you need to freeze your emotion, you need to be the Terminator, right? No emotions, only logic, and usually only logic and power. And we've learned a lot since then. Let me say that of course that is not what that not all of the, many of the books on negotiation did not say that, but even the books that didn't go that way, they didn't have much to offer us in the emotional realm. Again, think about Getting to Yes, which perhaps many of you have read. It doesn't talk much about emotions because the authors didn't, maybe they knew, but they didn't have much to offer in terms of emotions. We knew a lot less back then in terms of the science of emotions, and we had thought about it a lot less in terms of its contribution to conflict, its contribution to negotiation. So most early books on the subject didn't include any discussion of that. Later, there's a follow-on book written by Roger Fisher together with Danny Shapiro on, it's called Beyond Reason, and it's about both emotions and the less logical processes that go on when we're in conflict. It's not necessarily a deep dive into emotion. It's more into thinking again more about, they call it core concerns. But emotions have always been a tricky topic. And when we think about that, so by the time we got to mediation and mediation training, we started to recognize, and tell me if this is wrong about the mediation training as it's delivered in Brazil, but I've seen this around the world, that you recognize that emotions are an inherent and important part of the conflict, both the conflict in general and what's before you right in the room right now, right? Parties have general emotions that are tied to this conflict. It's become part of their identity, in fact, through this emotional pathway. And also in the room, they are acting emotionally, even when they're trying not to. And part of what negotiation training often relates to is the question of, what do we teach mediators about? Thank you for sharing that. Excellent. It's a great book. Those of you who have read Getting to Yes, you'll find that you flow into it very easily. A lot of the follow-on books to Getting to Yes have that benefit in which they sort of are really built as sequels. And so once you know getting to yes, you'll find this language very familiar, even though it's talking about a different topic. So a lot of what we often learn in negotiation training about emotions is, it's sometimes confusing and sometimes conflicting. And I think we need to think about this in a more complex way. We know that parties have emotions that are tied to the conflict. We know that there are emotions in the room. We know that sometimes those emotions can get away from parties, even though they didn't intend to. We know that that sometimes that emotions can get in the way of constructive communication. We know that emotions can get in the way of logical thinking. We know that emotions can get in the way of thinking about things in a new way, because emotions serve as an anchor, right? They lock us in place. That we know that we need to work with emotions, and yet we have mixed a direction on how to work with emotions. So one thing that we often learn is to allow parties to vent emotions, particularly at the beginning of a mediation. That's one thing that we often try. And another thing that we often try is to control emotion, either right from the start or sort of midway, at some point during the mediation. The mediators try to either control or channel emotion in order to lessen emotion and heighten logic. And of course, sometimes that plays a very constructive role, and done properly, it can play a very constructive role. Let's think about Star Wars for a moment, and then we'll come back to mediation. Think about Jedi training. When the Jedi approach to emotion is that emotion is bad. Emotion is harmful. Emotion gets between you and the Force. Ignore your own emotion, focus inwards, and it's not focus inwards in the sense of connect to your anger, connect to your sorrow, connect to your grief, connect to your jealousy. No, it's center yourself so a way you can move all that aside and connect only to the Force. And we see that it's both part of the Jedi code. There is no emotion, there is only peace. It's not in the movies, but still. In the movies, we see Obi-Wan Kenobi telling Luke, be wary of your feelings. They serve you well, but they can be made to serve the Emperor. And we hear and we see a lot of Jedi teachers, when their students are emotional, they tell them, stop, basically stop being emotional. And that both has to do with how the Jedi see connection to the Force. And it's also because they are concerned that emotions are so tricky that they will generally be a path to the dark side, right? So they don't serve the purpose of connecting to the Force, and they are likely to lead you down to the dark side. The Sith, the bad guys, so to speak, in the movie, the Vaders and the Palpatines and the Darth Mauls, they actually connect to emotions very powerfully. In fact, their connection to the Force is through emotion. Of course, it's through the dark side of emotions, right? It's through anger, it's through fear, it's through rage, it's through jealousy. That's how they connect to the Force, and they channel the power of those negative emotions in order to sort of overwhelm the Force, not work with the Force like the Jedi try to do, or let the Force use them, but rather to manipulate the Force and use it to their own ends. That's sort of the philosophical difference, but it's also a fundamental difference as to the purpose of emotions and how to work with them as a human being. And as mediators, I think we face exactly the same thing. We know logically that emotions are an important thing, and that we can work with them constructively. We can help parties use them helpfully and constructively. It'll help us get the real story out. It'll help them express to each other what's really on their mind, and also how much they care about it. It's also their way to connect to each other. People can connect through anger. At least they're communicating at the same level. They can communicate through grief. Those of you who've ever done a divorce mediation, they can communicate through anger. Those of you who have done workplace mediations. So, but also many mediators are scared of emotions. And I think that they're scared of emotions in much the way that the Jedi are. because they think, when people are speaking logically or relatively rationally, I can help them, and I can also, control or assist the flow of communication, depending on how you see yourself as a mediator. The moment emotion gets into the room, it's random, it's chaotic, and A, I can't be helpful to them, and B, I'm a little scared of that. And here's where I like to suggest to all of the mediators out there, and certainly and the mediator trainees, is that this is a good point to separate between two questions. And those questions are the question of, what do I think is helpful for parties, as opposed to the question of, what am I comfortable with? Because I think, and I say this after many years of reflection on myself as mediator and myself as mediation trainer, and sort of sitting with many other people in the mediation room, I've noticed that while we say we do everything in order to help parties, all of the decisions we make, all of the moves we make, we do that in order to give parties the best chance of moving forward. I think that when we look more deeply, we make a lot of those decisions because of ourselves and our comfort zones, much more than we admit, much more than we know, first of all, let alone admit, right? But, and so let me put this to you. Some of us are deeply uncomfortable when we're in a room and there's a lot of emotions being expressed, particularly negative emotions, even if they're not being aimed at us, right? Some of us are uncomfortable with negative emotions being expressed at us, but we're okay, and maybe even thrive on helping others navigate their negative emotions. Some of us are very uncomfortable with other people's negative emotions between them. And we say things like, no, okay, listen, remember how we both agreed that we'd speak about this in a reasonably calm tone. And so we essentially, we police, right? We act as the sheriff in the room. We point to the rules and said, that's not according to the rules. And they follow the rules. And we do it because we think that we're helping parties. And sometimes we do it because we're uncomfortable. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing to keep in mind is that people communicate differently. Some people communicate at their best through emotions. And if we impose a logical system of communication on them, we're not really helping. We think we are, but we're not really helping. What we need to do is to find a way for them to express that, and then find a way to make sure that the other party understands that, right? Maybe the other party doesn't communicate through emotions in that same way. So we're going to have to do some translation work, some reframing, but not by shutting this person down and then saying a reasonable message to this person, but by translating and explaining to them how these differences in communication are essential to why they are in conflict. And to be with them, to tell them, as I would, this is actually, we see Leia tossing a sharp comment towards Chewbacca when she wasn't really angry at Chewbacca at all. She was angry at Han Solo. And Han Solo and Leia have very different communicative patterns. But you're not going to solve any of their problems by saying, okay, like, nobody talk now, or nobody talk with emotion, or this is the only way that you're allowed to communicate. No, we have to work with the best in both people, even if what their best is inconvenient or painful or challenging to the other party or to us. So all this not to say that we can't ever, as mediators, change the emotional tone in the room or suggest changing the emotional tone in the room. It's just to suggest that I think that we're trained to do this more than we need to, and perhaps for reasons that are not the best reasons. And please don't think that I'm commenting in any way on those of you who are in a training program now or study. I'm not commenting on that. I'm talking about our field. But generally, I think we've gone down a wrong path in this, and that we need to do a little better. That's as far as negative emotions are. One thing to do with negative emotions, parties are shouting at each other. I've done this in a mediation room. Not everybody is comfortable with this, is to let parties shout at each other as long as they want to shout at each other, with the idea being that as long as they're in the room, we're still working. And of course, not everybody's comfortable with that, and it's not always constructive. But I've had mediations in which I've let people shout themselves out for 10 minutes, for 20 minutes, and when they were done, and then there was this, deadly silence in the room, which is both people are very angry, and they're also they're despairing because nothing has moved. Then just to step in and say, okay, that was a lot. That was and recognize the moment, and then to say, how would you like to move forward? Would you like to do more of what we just did now? Or would you like to try to have a different conversation, even though I know that that's hard right now? So you're not being like a smartass, right? Pardon me. You're not saying, well, how's that working out for you? So shouting isn't working. Let's go to cooperation, right? Follow my, no, it's not that. It comes from a very empathic place. We've all been in shouting fights. And we're offering ourselves as a guide to a different kind of conversation. And if we do that, we've shown them that we're willing to be with them in the dark side emotion place, but that we can show a different path forward. So those are emotions from the dark side. I'll comment to one other thing on that, is that in the chapter in our book on emotions that Gertkan and Velmer wrote, there's an interesting, Yoda said, and he says this more than once, he says, hate leads to fear, fear leads to anger, anger leads to fear, fear leads to hate, then it all leads to the dark side. There's this immediate progression that starts from either fear or from anger. You'll always go down to the dark side. But I think that in our own lives, we know that that's not necessarily true. We can get angry without it taking over our lives. Yoda was always worried that if Luke was angry even for one moment, forever will the dark side dominate his destiny, right? It'll just control him. And what that chapter in our book does is it takes a look at negative emotions, and it shows that actually there are ways in which negative emotions in the psychology in our galaxy, negative emotions don't necessarily play the role that Yoda thought they did. Now, Yoda's wisdom is, 900 years of wisdom. We're not going to argue with his wisdom on training Jedi, but in terms of human psychology in our world, sometimes anger actually it can help you focus, okay? It can help you, and there's a difference between, let's say, anger and rage. Just like there's a difference between anger and fear, right? Fear leads us to shut down, or it leads us to withdraw, or it leads us to lash out. Fear doesn't necessarily lead to a constructive. It also leads us to be cautious. And being cautious is sometimes very, very good. I think any of us who are parents here have sometimes used fear in order to save our children's lives, right? We explain to them what will happen if they put their finger into an electrical socket. And sometimes we explain it a little too graphically because we want them to be scared. Sorry, kids, right? But so it can serve that purpose. But anger in particular, the authors showed how anger can actually be turned and targeted towards pro-social activities. In other words, activities that aren't against someone else, but are actually benevolent to someone else. Now, sometimes, you get angry, so you're so angry, you just want to solve a problem. If you manage to channel anger into solving a problem, channel anger into separating from someone you shouldn't be connected to, sometimes, anger into, finding a solution so that we don't have to live in this angry place, that can actually serve a very positive purpose, and it doesn't lead us to the dark side. I think that in mediation training, as a field, we don't deal with the darker emotions, right? To some extent, we deal with anger, right? We know people get angry at each other, but we don't deal with rage, right? We know people can be angry, but can they be furious, outrage, have rage? And here, think about the words for this in Portuguese and sort of, the different nuances between languages. for an emotional scale of, let's say, all of the different types of anger that there are. Right? I come from, again, America and Israel. In Hebrew, which we speak in Israel, there's like, 2 words for different kind of anger. You're either annoyed or you're royally pissed off. And in English, there are, 20. There are many more words, emotionally nuanced words. There are 20 different points. And I think that we deal with the very low-level anger or annoyance when thinking about mediation, and we don't deal with rage. And we don't deal with a lot of the other dark side emotions. Like we deal with, people want things from another, so we talk about positions. And when we think about why they want things, we think about economics, right? They want money, they want whatever. We don't necessarily think about jealousy as an emotional driver for why are they presenting this position. And so parties don't even know that they can say jealousy because it's something that we don't admit to. And so it could be that there are these emotions from the dark side that are really fueling and driving everything going on, but we don't have the language to talk about emotions from the dark side, so we don't. And here's one good thing someone just commented in the chat. It just jumped into my view, how useful these things are with your 12-year-old. And let me tell you, I have a 12-year-old. They're useful with him. And not only that, but they're also the best place to practice. As to practice these to practice identifying, because if you ask your 12-year-old, right, I see that you're going through something and you appear really angry, and I'm trying to understand like what's behind it. Like, are you annoyed at this friend that you're telling me about, or are you jealous of what they have, or do you fear that you'll never have? And what's going on here? And you'll discover it depends on the 12. 12 is a tricky age. It's even better to work with younger children. But if your 12-year-old is an open 12-year-old child, as opposed to a, mom, I don't want to talk about it, then you'll be helping them work through that. And also you'll be practicing these nuanced, and then you'll realize that you can actually use those, say, oh, okay, jealousy, I get that. Anyone would envy someone in such and such a position. And so I wonder, is it now that you want to achieve that? Or, and you want to come up with a plan to achieving that? Or, are you just sharing this emotion you have and you want to leave it at that? Right? So you're helping them work through, do we want an action plan now? Or do we want to focus on the emotion? I hope that example was clear. I know I didn't give it any context. I jumped straight into the 12-year-old, but you can use that exactly that same pattern in a mediation room. And the last thing I'll say is that on the positive side of emotion, I don't think we work with that as much as we should either. Like we try to bring people to a sort of a more rational conversation. And sometimes we ask people, are you satisfied? But, we don't focus on joy, right? We don't focus on even on happy or above. And while we could get into that, let me just focus on one thing. One role that we do in mediation is we are a provider of hope. And this, here we go straight back to what you said, Fernando, and such a core theme in the movie. We are the representatives of optimism in the room. Parties, they came there maybe because they were optimistic that it could be worked out. That's a dangerous assumption to make. Those of you who are just getting into mediation will know. Sometimes they've been forced into mediation. Sometimes they came to mediation because they thought it was arbitration. Sometimes a judge told them they have to and they don't have any choice. They might have 1,000 reasons. People don't necessarily come to mediation because they think they'll be able to solve their problems there. And assuming that that's why they came will lead you into trouble later on. So but still, once we have them in the room, we can be the source of optimism. And we can say, look, I don't know that we can reach a resolution here. I don't know that there's a great way out of this, but I'm willing to work with you as long as you're willing to work on finding it. And you know what? Based on my experience, more often than not, parties in really difficult situations are able to work their issues out with one another. So even if you think that it's challenging, okay, we've all been in challenging places. And even if you reach a really dark place, you might be the one to say, we're in a really dark place right now. And I have the feeling that both of you are thinking that this is pointless and this will never resolve. And that's legitimate. I'm not going to, I'm not going to play the smiley, chirpy people. But I will share that I have been with parties in exactly this emotional state of despair, often. And I know that they're often able to work out of it. So if you're able to garner up the energy to give it another, to give it some more time, to make another effort, maybe we can change things up. I think there's still hope. If you're willing to hope, then we can keep working. So we actually bring that optimism in the room long after parties, are willing not to be the optimistic party. And that's something we can do endlessly until the moment that they say, nah, in which case it's our job to say, that's your, I respect your autonomy. Absolutely. I don't want to solve this more than you want to solve this, of course. That's great. You don't want to work this out. I appreciate the time that you spent, the efforts that you've made. You both put a lot in. Thank you for sharing all this with me and bringing me into your life. And then you turn off that optimism, because otherwise it's a false emotion that comes from the outside that isn't serving them. So there's a role for positive emotions in the room, again, beyond what we do. And Fernando, as you say, any question that you ask me, I can just go on forever. So maybe the polite thing to do now would be for me to just shut up and I'd love to. Thank you. Thank you so much. I hardly know where to start for. I mean, thank you for bringing me, but that last surprise of bringing me, closer into your home is so wonderful. Thank you for showing me your place. And of course, particularly those who are Star Wars fans, think about the thrill you feel in your body when you hear the music start to play. And there might be more we can do in conflict with embodied emotions. Think about the thrill in your body and the emotion that led. And just one final recommendation. There's a professor named Michel LeBaron who talks about the embodiment of conflict, of how we have conflict outside, but we carry it with us. And so it's not only like we talk about body language, but it's so much more. And I would recommend looking for some of that while remembering how that first passage of music thrilled you, starting from here and then leading up here. How might we turn that in conflict? And then, of course, the picture of everybody joining, everybody coming, the gathering together for a shared purpose, which is so much of our work. I could not think of a more thrilling or fitting or heartwarming ending act. So Fernando, that is magnificent. I want to thank all of you for sharing time with me. I've read the chat. I understood the English ones and identified with a lot of them. I understood a few words in the Portuguese ones, and I'm sorry that I don't share your language. In a perfect world, I'd be more like C-3PO, fluent in 6 or 7 million forms of communication. There's always hope. Thank you for sharing time with me. Fernando, thank you so much for inviting me. Of course, Simone and Amanda, whose voice you're actually hearing all of this time. Thank you for being my voice. Thank you for being everybody's voice. I know that this work is not easy. It's really meaningful. Thank you both. That's it. Anything I just say now is going to be more thanks. So why don't you wrap up, Fernando? I love it.
I would like to thank the work of everybody who helped us put together this wonderful event with Professor Noam. I would like to thank Amanda and Simone, our always competent and great translators, interpreters who are here helping us to understand these wonderful talks by wonderful speakers. I would like to thank the Regional Labor Court of the 9th Region team for putting together this event, this webinar. I would like to thank each and everyone for attending, for your comments. More and more comments are in the chat room saying how wonderful your talk was, Professor Noam. Thank you so much. So I wish you have a wonderful day. And Professor Noam, I know that in the US, they say happy Friday, TGIF, but in Brazil, you say sextou. It's a kind of TGIF. It's non-translatable, but it could be TGIF. It's Friday at last. So
I'll Google it.
I hope that's it. Oh, thank you very much. Thank you.